hard as it is to find the permanent nest of the wandering ants. It is easy to discover their camping places, used only briefly, as they make these in hollow trees, stumps and holes in the earth. The real nest, if we may speak of it as such, consists at such times of themselves, very often. Their facility in the building, utilizing themselves as the structure's stones, is fabulous. They span a road while marching, making an arch beneath which the others pass so that they may be shielded from the severe rays of the sun. They build ladders in which one end clings to another, in regular living rows, sometimes a yard long, hanging to the ground from the tree branch on which they wish to camp. The rest of the community climbs up this living ladder to the branch. Similarly, they build living bridges to cross a stream. The camping nest is built somewhat in the same fashion, but instead of forming long chains, they mass themselves into huge balls. In the center, they have their brood and their queen, together with all their booty. They wrap themselves all around this, holding onto one another. A ball nest of this kind may contain a cubic yard of ants, uncounted and uncountable. The most astounding feature of this living structure is that it has channels running into the center, and there is as lively running in and out as if it were a nest made of earth. The hunters are ever bringing in more booty through the living passages, so we see that they can make of themselves not only ladders and bridges but tubes as well. The added peculiarity of the ball nest is that it may move as a whole. In case of a flood, the nest becomes a veritable living ark. The enormous ball floats in the water, with the brood and the queen inside, until it finally rests upon some saving Mount Ararat. Chapter 5. The Agricultural Ants. It is not pleasant to deal with bulldog ants, nor are the wandering ants to be despised. But by comparison with the fire ants or the bearded ants, they are quite harmless. The pain of a single sting from one of the latter lasts for hours, and a couple of stings make a man helpless for some time. The pain spreads through the arms and legs. It is paralyzing, and makes one dizzy and helpless. The sting certainly carries severe poisoning, but what kind is as yet unknown. It is certainly not formic acid. I have never heard of it causing death, nor do there appear to be any permanent ill effects. After a few hours, I felt perfectly well. Yet a large number of stings might well cause death. We know that in the time of the Aztecs, when capital punishment was inflicted, the bearded ants served as executioners. Yet it must be said that, unlike the wandering ants, these fire ants or bearded ants never attack man without cause either by night or by day. They use their stings only when man touches them or their cities. In such cases, they prove that they have nothing to learn from the most advanced torturers or the most advanced punishers of mankind. A burnt child dreads the fire, and any child once burnt by the fire ants will make a wide detour around any one of their nests. A person must be a self-sacrificing priest of myrmecological science, or an inquisitive fool like myself if he puts his nose into their hole to see how it looks inside. In olden times, to be sure, the poets and sages were not so inquisitive. Among the Oriental, Greek, and Roman poets, we read some very wise remarks about the ant, but they usually had to do with the harvesting ant. All of them observed ants outside of their nests, no one ever seeming to think it necessary to look inside. So we read that King Solomon made the appeal, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provide her meat in the summer and gather her food in the harvest." If the king had ordered one of his slaves to dig up a nest, he would have found out that though they have no captain, master, or prince, they still have a queen, quite as noble as that Queen of Sheba of whom he made a friend. Nevertheless, the royal proverb is correct, for this queen in Antland gives no orders, and sends forth no messengers to gather grain at harvest time. The mother queen is only a living symbol of the community thought of the ant people. Every single citizen lives the spirit to work for the community, none requiring any order from lords or captains. All harvesting ants belong to the third great group of andom, the knotted ants, while the stinging ants and wandering ants are almost exclusively meat eaters, supporting themselves by hunting. The harvesting ants have adopted vegetarianism. However, they do not despise a good bit of flesh when it comes their way. This development shows a higher evolution, brought about by the struggle for existence. There can be no question that the large ant peoples could be supported more easily if they were not dependent entirely upon meat, but at the same time used vegetables. Nature has provided them with the necessary implements and the powerful upper jaws, which are quite as well adapted for the killing and tearing apart of living prey as for breaking up and grinding grain. The peoples of most of the grain gatherers are numerous and have large cities. These cities have been found over 12 yards in diameter, running 7 feet into the earth and standing 20 inches above the surface. The deepest storerooms for grain are sometimes 5 inches in diameter. Harvesting ants live in all 5 divisions of the globe. They differ in many respects yet are alike in a general way. They are the best road builders, and their nests are really plastered. They pass in long lines along their roads, busily transferring grain to the nest. Some species use one road to go to the place from which they are gathering grain, and another for returning with their burdens. One-way streets, we would call them. They are veritable harvesters. Not only do they gather the separate grains that have fallen to the ground, but they climb the stalks and cut off the ripe grain, sometimes entire ears. Almost every kind of seed suits them, as well as any insects they happen to encounter on their roads or in the fields. These they kill and carry back with them as welcome booty. Division of labor is highly developed. There are workers of various types, and each one undertakes the kind of labor for which it is best adapted. The gathering and storing of grain offers manifold activity. Some do nothing but clip the grain from the stalk, the cutters. Others bear it to the nest porters, just inside the door. They give their burdens to other ants which take the grain and remove the husk. The husks are taken out of the nest and thrown upon the rubbish heap, which is sometimes huge. It may be observed that the porters sometimes bring things of no possible use, either as food or for any other purpose. When these are surrendered at the door, they are taken out very quickly to be thrown away. Any layman would say that a wise examiner sat inside the door whose duty was to decide what could be used and what could not. This is certainly true. The ants that receive everything at the door know very well what is useful. They are much wiser than the porters. I often gave these porters the most impossible things, such as matches, glass beads, and empty snail shells. The wise ones drop them or push them off their road. The stupid ones pick them up and carry them to the nest. There they are cast out promptly. The ants sometimes bring in green grains, small leaves, petals of roses, or other flowers, but after a few days, these are thrown out of the nest. They cannot serve as food, but they may serve some other purpose that we do not as yet understand. Some ants remove the hulls from seeds, and other ants take the hulls to the rubbish heap. Smaller creatures take the grains to the granary and pile them in order. Still others serve as nurses, midwives, and caretakers of the brood and of the queen. Feeding and cleansing them, and doing all the housework, is a matter of course. The granaries, often 100 or more, are deep underground, in the driest places. Nevertheless, it happens frequently that the seeds are moistened and begin to sprout. Then the ants bite off the sprouts and lay the seeds in the sun to dry. If they want to eat off their store, they moisten the seeds to make them sprout artificially, gnaw off the sprouts, and then dry them. Then, they only eat up the entire seed or grain. Certainly, the ants do not know that in the sprouting process, the starch content of the grain is changed into sugar, and that the drying out corresponds to the process of making malt. But they do know very well that grain treated in this way tastes sweeter and that it is easier to strip. Brioni, the island on which I am riding, is full of harvester ants. If I get up from my riding table, I need to take but a few steps to reach their cities. The Duke of Civitella has charge of the horses and stables on the island. At first, he thought that I was crazy when he saw me crouched for hours at a time, studying the ugly six-leggers, while he was jumping the hurdles accompanied by beautiful women. Now, however, when he sees me, he gets down from his horse. He does not jump the stone wall anymore and allows no one else to do so, for just there lives a large ant people, to which I carry wheat and rice. Don Peppino, said I to him, now I am going to show you something new. These dear creatures can not only gather grain, but they can bake bread of it. The tall Duke let his horse graze, lay down, and stared at the ground. Do you see their drying place, Don Peppino? And now watch, and see how they bring their loaves for the sun to bake. Civitella took up one and tasted it. Rather bitter, said he. I nodded. You are right, Duke, but the loaves are not finished. They will be sweetened again in the nest. Don Pepino had never had anything to do all his life, except with horse. Occasionally, of course, a maiden intervened. He shook his head and sighed that I should ever bother myself about ants. No one ever sang to me about them in my cradle. The grains had sprouted and then been hulled. Now they were ground up and made into dough with spittle. Reddish-brown loaves had been shaped, as large as a peppercorn. These were brought to a dry place in the sun. The bake oven of these small bakers that the grain harvesters are prone to gather where the harvest belongs to someone else is not remarkable. Andem has strict commandments and obeys them far more faithfully than Christians do the 10 Commandments of Moses. The law of the ants is not written down, but every individual citizen of each people feels and lives this law every moment of life. It reads, "Do all that thou dost for the welfare of thy people. Do not against the well-being of thy people." If then a harvesting ant people plunders the storehouse of another people by force, or steals grain from the barn of man, according to the ant conscience that is neither robbery nor stealing, it is no sin, but a good deed. We humans do the same thing when we take the honey out of a beehive, or take the grain from an ant nest. We do this very thing. In fact, that very question has been settled by law, which establishes the ownership of the grain taken from an ant nest, that it is the property of the ants. Never for a moment bothers us, man, for all that is on earth belong to us. All that we may argue about is to which of men the ant's store belongs. The Jewish law settles the matter thus. The grain found in an ant nest amid the standing grain belongs to the owner of the field. If the ant nest be found behind the harvesters, the grain found on top belongs to the poor. What is below in the store chambers, to the owner of the field. Rabbi Meir holds, however, all belongs to the poor, for doubtful gleanings are to be considered as gleanings. Mishnah Pia, chapter 4, section 11. To understand this, we must know that the Mosaic law ordained that at every harvest, 3 things did not belong to the owner of the field. The gleanings what the harvesters draw, the overlooked stalks uncut, and the corners of the field, which are left uncut for the benefit of the poor. Thus, the grains which lie on top, last brought into the ant's nest, were evidently dropped by the harvesters, as they were taking in the sheaves plainly gleanings, which belong to the poor, but the grain deep in the store chambers may have been brought in before the human harvesters began their work. If harvesting had not begun, the grain certainly belongs to the owner of the field, for no question of gleanings can arise. If the field has been cut, the nest being behind the harvesters, the upper part certainly belongs to the poor, the lower part to the field's owner. This last was contested by some of the legalists. Thus Rabbi Meir, who held that where there was a doubt about gleanings, they should be considered gleanings, decided that even lower stores belong to the poor, as some grains of the gleanings might have been placed in the lower chambers by the ants. So we see how the poor and the owners of the fields may have argued about their legal right to the grain stored by the ants. But it is by no means an easy matter to dig out one of these nests and recover the grain from the chambers, which may hold a few handfuls of wheat. Notwithstanding all this highly sharp and juristical decision, the ants seem to us to be entitled to enjoy their own store in peace and quiet. It is quite interesting to see to what degree the harvest ants have interested the sages of Mediterranean lands. Notably, the Jewish, Christian, and Arabian prophets failed to remark on a notable characteristic of these ants that live on the borders of the desert. Pious Muslims swear today by the beard of the prophet. If the ants could swear, they too might use the same formula, for they have real beards. The beard is possibly a beautiful adornment for man. It certainly has no use, but it is quite otherwise with the desert daughters of Andom. Their bushy beards have a special purpose. When they return from their harvesting, the workers are covered with sand and dirt. Their first care is to cleanse themselves and their burdens. They do this with the brushes that they have on their front legs, but that leaves these brushes dirty, so they want to cleanse them in turn. To do this, they draw the brushes through their beards, just as we clean our combs. This, however, is not all the purpose of the beard. The cities of the harvesting ants are built in the sand, and every grain of sand must be removed from the soil. They can carry only a few grains in their mouths. If they had a sack into which they could throw a lot of sand, it would be very handy. The bristles of their beards serve as the sack. They cling together, holding fast to one another, forming a sack for each worker, which saves them many trips when they are building. Without exception, ants are ungrateful creatures. On one occasion, I pulled a ball of fire ants out of the water like the nomad ants. They form large balls and allow themselves to be rolled along, and as thanks for saving them, they stung me viciously. And my warm affection for the Mexican and Texan bearded ants has been rewarded only by savage stings. Nevertheless, I shall return good for evil and protect the ants from the learned men of our day, who seem to try in their writings to make out that the six-leggers are very wicked indeed, and omit no opportunity of accusing them of being dull and stupid. In treating the Texan bearded ants, one investigator, in the 60s of the last century, said that they not only harvest but also sow, and that, especially around their nests, they plant the so-called ant grass, Aristida, the seed of which they prize highly. He goes further, saying that in the spaces around their nests, this grass and none other is allowed to grow. This observation was accepted by no less a personage than Darwin, who noted and published it. But the exact science of our time pronounces this a pious fraud, a wicked joke at which every Texan schoolchild laughs. The scientists explain it thus: the seeds of Aristida are moistened in the nest, begin to sprout, and progress too far to be stopped by drying. These seeds, which have become useless in the nest, are thrown on the rubbish heap by the ants, where they take root, as further proof against the supposition that the ants sow the seeds themselves. The following is laid down distinctly. 1. Some nests of the bearded ants have no Aristida. 2. Aristida also grows in many places where there are no ants' nests. 3. The ants often build their nests some 30 yards away from any field, upon some road, for the Aristida garden would never suffice to support the numerous people of the bearded ants, so they have to build long roads, and the presence of these roads alone is enough to reduce the myth of sowing ants to absurdity. This crushing argument has been repeated by one professor after the other, each one apparently being glad that once again he can destroy all evidence of intelligence in ants. Well, professors, let us examine these proofs a little more closely. Exact science has been attempting for many years to destroy the myths and legends told by lay observers of natural phenomena. The laity, travelers, poets, and nature lovers have, however, in many instances proved themselves to be correct. This is notably true for the students of ants. Ever since the scientific study of ants began, say about 1750, the learned scientists have laughed loudly at what the older classics, Hesiod, Aesop, Plutarch, Plautus, Horace, Virgil, Ovid, Pliny, and many others related about the habits of ants. All was either nonsense or humbug, mere poetic fantasy. It was a fairy tale indeed that the ants went out harvesting, stored the grain in special chambers, and prevented it from sprouting by drying it in the sun. But the investigations of the last decades have proved clearly and directly that every observation of the old myth-tellers was correct. And let us not forget the bearded ants of Texas. Do you think, dear professors, that you have proved the lack of intelligence on the part of ants when you deny to this species the foresight of who sows shall reap, when in other places you state that other species possess a similar foresight? If, a few pages before, you have said that the gardener ants sow seeds in their hanging lamps, the rooting of these seeds giving the necessary solidity to the round hanging gardens made of earth. If then, a few pages later, you say that an entire series of ants cultivate mushrooms as food for themselves, all of this you do not deny, then why not be fair enough to admit that similar known or unknown foresight, showing itself as sowing to reap, belongs to the cultivators of the Aristida? As to the 4 pieces of evidence cited against sowing by our agricultural ants, I must say that seldom have I seen such flimsy proofs of anything. Admitted that a few seeds of ant grass may sprout sporadically around the ant nest, no one would expect anything else, and probably this first suggested to the ants the idea of sowing. Why then do not the ants cut off their sprouts, inasmuch as they do eradicate all other vegetation around their nests? Admitted that Aristida grass grows thickly there, why shouldn't it? Admitted that these ants build their nests sometimes on the roads, far away from the fields, especially when there is a farm nearby, where they can find grain. What does that signify? Admitted that some cities of the bearded ants have no plantation of Aristida grass. It is a fact repeated 1,000 times in Endem that one person has a custom that another person of the same species no longer has or has not inherited. Admitted finally that the provision supplied by the plantation around the nest was not nearly enough to support the population. Would the kitchen gardens near any of our great cities begin to feed the inhabitants? Do not we humans build roads in every direction along which our food is brought? Do we not gather our food over sea and land from the ends of the earth? Is there any proof that the grain fields near the large cities owe their existence to accident? And how are we to explain that only Aristida grass grows near the nests of the bearded ants, and no other plant? No, my dear professors, this is not the way to disprove legends. You might be able to do so with schoolboys, for I must acknowledge that I do not admit any great authority for schoolboys, even if Texans. The nonsensical tales of Aesop, Solomon, and Virgil are proved true. Even the most fatuous pedants can no longer deny the truth of the fairy tales about the harvesting ants. If scientists regard skeptically whatever the laity, travelers, artists, and poets of nature relate to their observations, that is their right, but they must not take it ill in us artists if we, on our side, take what the scientists tell us for what it is: stupid work, in which the gift of the artist to conceive something intuitively, some rare cases excepted, is altogether lacking. Dame Science ought to begin really to be a little wiser. I must continue to believe the fairy tale of the sewing ants, and I am convinced that future really deep study will establish its truth, as well as that of the ant legends of the ancient poets. Chapter 6. Artisan Ants. In some earthly creatures we find a calling, some artistic gift, a talent which may be developed to perfection. But only among men and ants do we find a complete series of artistic powers. In Antum we have spinners, carpenters, paper makers, roofers, hunters, agriculturists, bakers, miners, herders, coopers, plasterers, mushroom growers, tapestry makers, gardeners, cutters, nurses, governesses, sick nurses, soldiers, scouts, guards. There are professional slaveholders, thieves, robbers, loafers. Of course, mankind has some others, but among the ants, there are callings not known to man. For instance, the profession of the living door among the carpenter ants, or the living cask known among the honey ants, both quite as strange to man as the compulsory regicide.